my big nerdy thing is, isn't that so cool? There's so much that we do. Look at all the wonderful ways we do it. Let's celebrate them. But then, my scientific question is, why is it harder for some people to exist than others? And in certain situations, why is it maybe very difficult for most people to exist?
Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. I am your host, as always, Talia Sherman, and this episode could not be more fitting as it is the tail end of Women's History Month. Today, I'm talking to the inspiring, the amazing, the brilliant Dr. Kelly Elizabeth Wright. She's incredible. That'll be abundantly clear throughout the interview. Throughout this conversation, there's a lot of feminism and a lot of rants against the world and a lot of little anecdotes and quips about how women are doing language and doing self differently than other people, and the ways in which women's language is not taken seriously or not accepted or ridiculed. But also, broadly, I think that this interview is another reminder that linguistics isn't always about language. We're interested in other things, right? How we are doing presentations of self. We're interested in broad ideas and concepts that are intensely complicated, like racism and sexism and oppression, right? This is not intrinsically connected to language. It's just done through language. And I love that throughout this interview, there'll be so many reminders and examples of how language is a proxy for a lot of different things, but it's not necessarily just about the language. And here's where usually I talk about how fun it was to edit and produce the episode you're about to hear. In this case, I can't say that truthfully because this episode was actually incredibly painful to edit, because every single thing that she says throughout this episode, I think we should take as gospel and frame on a wall. But yet there are time constraints and narrative things. And so, to that end, I have put the unedited and full version of the interview on YouTube, and you can check it out there. So when you're done with this episode and you realize that you just are craving more and more information and insights from Kelly, go to YouTube and find them. But for now, please enjoy the humor and the wit and the brilliance of Dr. Kelly Elizabeth Wright. Dr. Kelly Elizabeth Wright, welcome to the podcast. I'm so thrilled to have you here.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Yes, of course. So we met at the Linguistic Society of America's annual meeting, and immediately it just became clear to me that everyone was talking about this postdoc, this woman, Dr. Kelly Elizabeth Wright. She is the person, right? You're being referenced by everyone as the person who's doing the sociolinguistic work that needs to be done. So please introduce yourself. Tell the world who you are and what you do and why you do it and what you're about.
Hi, thank you so much. I am Dr. Kelly Elizabeth Wright. I'm an experimental sociolinguist and lexicographer, and my work is broadly focused on understanding the creation and maintenance of linguistic ideology, both over time and in real time. For a fun, full-throated answer, experimental sociolinguistics. Sociolinguistics is the branch of linguistics that's most interested with social forces, how they're formed and how they work in language. And the experimental part means that I bring people into the lab to answer those questions instead of looking at primary text or working with corpora or doing other things, right? And then a lexicographer is a word mapper, somebody who puts words in the dictionary. So that's my other big job, which I really love. And to me is, the work there is part of understanding creation of ideology, maintenance over time and in real time. So it's a lot of fun. And yeah, it was wonderful to meet you. I've never been in one of these spaces where I actually had seen the person in real life. So this is a lot of fun.
Yeah. I've been so interested in this idea that you're kind of experimental sociolinguist and also lexicographer and all these other things. And that's really cool, especially because I feel like linguists often hate the concept of a word. And yet there you are working with words, which kind of makes you interesting in that sense. But what I feel like has really drawn me to your research in general has just been this consistent. You're talking all the time about big words that might not make a lot of sense, like sociolinguistic labor and linguistic justice and just usage and ideas that are sometimes I could think, oh, maybe that's theoretical, but I don't know if it certainly is. So what are these key terms that you use and what do they mean? Where are we going here with just usage and linguistic oppression, right?
Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah. Okay. So it's interesting because a lot of what I do sort of sits at the line in between what the public understands language to do and what linguistics is, and then also what linguistics is, what the organized study of language in a scientific manner looks like and can look like. There's a few key terms, right, that sit here. One of them that's interesting that you didn't mention, and I want to get back to oppression and labor, of course. Yay, my favorite things to talk about.
You know,
Is code switching. So I am very specific in my work. I talk about style shifting, but I also code switching is this thing that people know that they do. Like people who are not linguists know exists. They translate it into all forms of life, not just linguistics, like how you dress, how you walk. Even I've heard people say like the way they carry items. This woman came up to me after a talk once and told me that her in-laws make her very nervous. And so when they're all getting out of the car or something to like go into a Denny's, she's always like picking up everyone's stuff, like carrying extra stuff. So like nobody has anything in their hands. She's like, it's like when you notice yourself on the phone with like a stranger, like an adult male, and like your voice goes up 3 octaves and you're like, who is she? Who is this woman who just spoke for the last 45 seconds? It's like that of like somehow some things in our lives just trigger this movement into a different way of being. And it doesn't really have anything to do with oppression on its face, right? It just has to do with what it means to inhabit an identity in the world. So that's a big part of what I'm actually interested in, is like doing self, or what it means to just be a person out in the world. And my big nerdy thing is, isn't that so cool? There's so much that we do. Look at all the wonderful ways we do it. Let's celebrate them. But then, my scientific question is, why is it harder for some people to exist than others? And in certain situations, why is it maybe very difficult for most people to exist, like a courtroom? No one is comfortable in that space, and the language there is very unnatural and incredibly codified, right? We know there's a secret, but nobody really understands it, right? So it's something of like, what are these most uncomfortable spaces tell us, and what do these most comfortable spaces tell us? Linguistic oppression, I didn't really realize that was what I was interested in at first, because I didn't even realize linguistics is what I was interested in at first. The first research project that I did that led me into this field was about Ghanaian nationalism. Yeah, seems very out there. But what I observed as an undergraduate literature student in like a required history class was Kwame Nkrumah, this first president of Ghana, Ghana being this first African nation to wrest independence away from a colonial government, is speaking English. And everything that I was reading was not in translation in this class where we're reading like lots of things in translation. He's speaking English, and why? Like I went all the way to Ghana with this research question of why couldn't Pan-Africanism be done in an African language? Like, it just didn't make sense. And so this bigger question of like, why was the arena of like global politics not a place for an African language? Why aren't those languages represented? Why can't you put it on a stop sign? Those questions fall under linguistic oppression. It turns out falls under linguistic oppression. So it's really no different than other forms of oppression. Certain ways of languaging are not preferred or allowed or appropriate or accepted or expected or valued in certain spaces. And those most important spaces being the ones that secure your freedom or your healthcare or your place to live or your right to leave the country or your right to enter the country. So linguistic oppression is just this language-based side of all the isms that we know.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a lot of things you said there, but number one is this question of why does she have to carry the baggage, right?
Yup.
There's that, right? There's like totally a metaphor in there. If she's carrying their baggage, like she's picking up everyone's things, supporting everyone. Like the Mark system is being ignited. All this, like women are picking up the slack, right? But then also, all these forms of oppression, whether it's linguistic or otherwise, I think come down to like a common frustration and common feelings and like not necessarily common ways of resolving them, but
Well, and the common behavior really is part of it, because I mean, yes, please bring up Marx. Let's talk about sociolinguistic labor, because it is about valuing. You can take like the most scientific entry into this conversation by thinking about physics. Linguistic production is material.
yeah,
all material has value on the market, right? So it's like I physically actually produce a pressure wave to communicate speech. You know, I'm moving my hands, I'm doing something, I'm writing, right? Like all of these things are creating materials. So what that means is sociolinguistic labor then is the cost or the act of doing self in the world, of moving that material around and having it recognized as such. Because so Rusty Barrett, Brianna Cornelius, these folks are working on this thing. The paper is called You Met My Ambassador. And it's this idea of there's these three parts of self, like who I feel I am, what I show to people, and what they see. So if you're a trans woman, you're feeling that you are female on the inside and you're trying to perform femininity for the world, and you are waiting for that moment where the world passively accepts you as an adult female back, that it's not with an asterisk, that you just get to inhabit femininity. So this is like having those three forms of self in alignment is really important. That's maybe something like using language in a state of rest, a labor-free state of usage. Uncommodified language use is when you're feeling that all of those selves are working. When it's not in alignment, that's when language use feels more laborful. So fast forward then to conversations with professionals and asking them about how they work, what their work lives are like not even saying, how do you use language in these scenarios? Nothing even that specific. Asking them just to observe what their professional lives are like. Many professionals from minoritized backgrounds or non-normative backgrounds, people who have, ability issues, etc., things that aren't embodied in the way that we think of them traditionally. They all report feeling like they have to shift their self in some way to exist in the workplace. That it's either, like I was saying, like you're walking down the hallway and you see some random man in your workplace and you're like, hi, Jim, like, hi, Jim, like way
Hi.
too high. Hi, Jim. It's this thing of like, who is that? Who is this woman that just jumped out of my mouth? Like, I don't even know Jim. He doesn't even work in my department. Like, why did I feel compelled to say hello to him? When your grandparents are around, you maybe aren't using profanity, or taking the Lord's name in vain, something that you feel comfortable doing in your own age group, but in around elders is like a way that you filter. That this is something that we all really understand, that again, like doesn't have anything to do necessarily with oppression. It just has to do with like what it means to be younger than someone else. But when we get into looking at who does the most work out in the world, it ends up being the same people who are at the most risk in the world.
Yeah. And I don't even know if there's been any kind of linguistic analysis into like what happens when we see someone that we like or have a crush on, because that's a voice that jumps out of us and like we don't know who that is. But I know that there's like some idea. I think it's that like your voice is naturally gets a little bit more high pitched if you're a woman, and straight women specifically. And I find that like weird. I like get like goosebumps in like a really annoying way. Like, ooh, like the physiology of like being feminine, like
Yeah.
like, ooh, like, or like what that sort of like triggers in your head. But it's true. But I think like all of that is somehow this idea, this presupposition that to be more accepted in the workplace to Jim who's walking down the hallway, or to be seen as more attractive, you have to be this kind of like more feminine
Yeah.
persona. You have to project something that's closest to what the world would want you to be, right? And that obviously gets kind of fraught when you get into like, well, sometimes speaking that way in a job interview is actually going to get you the job
Right.
as opposed to speaking a different way. But that's a really hard problem to reconcile. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you get the job. And you work for 40 years sounding like a different woman. At some point, do you become her?
Right.
Like, are you still you? There's a study that I cite. It's from Jones and Shorter Gooden from 2003. They surveyed 300 Black women at work. And these women talk about invisibility, and like the way for me to be successful in this space is not to be seen. But then what am I contributing to this space if I'm not visible here? And the minute I become visible, like my livelihood is at risk. So you met my ambassador, like none of these people know me, but they're also the people I spend the most time with. So it's such a conundrum.
So I've been watching a lot of the talks that you've given at different like schools and conferences and things like that. And I am first of all blown away by your speaking skills and the passion and all these other things. I mean, like truly. But secondly, you come at linguistic oppression from a really interesting angle, and it's a lot of times historical, right? Talking about literacy laws and like the actual legal historical precedents and the reason for which today we find linguistic oppression through like laws that try to oppress language as a proxy, of course, always for other things. It's never actually about, language. It's about race, it's about class, it's about gender. So language literacy laws. What is going on with the suppression of literacy? Because that to me feels like a suppression of power and a suppression of equal opportunity,
Yeah.
especially if we're talking about the economics of it all. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for asking this. Thank you for asking this because the historical focus of this work, or my work in general, I do it for two reasons. One of them, and you had a guest, Nicole Holiday, on here. She talked about this, about how linguistics is necessarily interdisciplinary because language is everywhere. And so reading really widely is something that a lot of us are called to do just to understand the phenomenon we're observing, to be able to describe the patterns that emerge in our data. So I started doing work on athletes, on Black athletes, in the way that they've been described over time in the media. And that over time part came in because I was looking just at Serena Williams at first. I was looking like just at the texts that have been produced across her career. But I began to realize that I could observe patterns, but I couldn't really understand them. Many people, when I would present that work, were asking me things like, well, how do you know it's not about her gender? How do you know that what you're observing is about race, is racialization? How do you know it's not about her gender? How do you know it's not about her size? How do you know it's not about this conglomeration of things that makes an individual what she is? And I'm like, okay, how can I know? And part of that was go back in time, get as much time depth as I could. So instead of looking at one athlete, I looked at athletes over 100 years. And when you start to realize that I'm looking at 100 years and what I'm seeing is older than that because it's everywhere. So you go back as far as you have to go back to find where this pattern starts, to be like, okay, so linguistic oppression starts with the 1705 codification of slavery in this country, essentially, because when we're talking about racialized linguistic oppression, when we're talking about the things that started moving the words I was looking at in this athletics corpus, because I'm looking at words like unstoppable, insatiable, fierce, and people who are being paid to fight in slave yards, forced to fight in slave yards, bet it, a whole gambling ring and a whole economy grew around their bodies smashing into each other without their consent. Unstoppable, insatiable, fierce. So these same words are describing not describing the white men who are wrestling as professionals at this time, right? So as old as that. Part of what I talk about with linguistic oppression in general, there's this fine line. Linguistic discrimination is like both this operation that happens in our minds and also something that exists in the world. So discrimination, that's like telling the difference between two things, of saying this voice is higher pitched than that voice. The speaker is closer to me or farther away. It's this, it's that. It's categorizing, putting things into groups, pattern matching, which is what our mind is doing at all times. There's nothing wrong in noticing that a voice comes from a woman or a Black person or anything, somebody from the South, somebody, right? There's no harm in noticing. It's just, what do you do? What do our minds do with that information once it's been noticed? How are we binning it? The answer to that, how are we binning it question is as old as text. We have had our ideas about women, about Black people, about people with disabilities, about immigrants since before the printing press. So the minute we started printing the Gutenberg Bible, this like first mass-produced text, that again, a business model. When language was written, people of color, women, the poor, already systematically kept out of material knowledge production. They were already not allowed to write. It was already in motion when we started printing text. So Black people, when we fast forward, 300 and some odd years to enslaved people in, what is too soon to become America, this codification of slavery, this document is important because it tells us, it actually shows the dehumanization of this population. It shows us that they were able to use language, again, to like reclassify the humanity of an entire group of people. And it's something that we've seen happen over and over again, but in our immediate context, we have an actual document, signed by actual humans in, full light of day, that shows us where they said, we don't want these people to have access to the written word. We don't want them to be able to read. We don't want them to be able to communicate with each other. We believe that keeping them under domination is important because they can't actually become literate anyway. So, what's the point of teasing them with it, essentially, is sort of how the document reads, is like, don't make them want something they can never have. Which, like, aren't we so paternalistic? It really comes from a place of care. And I think showing everybody these documents is important to me because I didn't know they existed until I was like 33. And the gymnastics, the verbal gymnastics, it is everything about language all tied together. The history, what it does for our present, the way the words are being used, what the words do in the world. It's all present in this like 2 sheets of paper.
Yeah, yeah. But I think it just comes down to the fact that language is power, and we cannot underestimate that, and we cannot diminish that at all. This is power, and this is it. And it's education and it's literacy. Yeah. So that's just important, I think.
Yeah, and this like literacy is threatening, right?
Yeah.
It remains
Yeah.
threatening as we see something, I think, in a talk I gave in mid-October last year. At that point, something like 3,100 books had been banned in the US just in 2023. There are laws that restrict things that you can say in public, more censorship laws than we've had since the era of sedition in this country. So it's something to think about. Our rights to read and write and speak aloud remain things that have to be reinforced. They're certainly not inalienable.
So it is this idea that there is linguistic oppression, and then there is the linguistic ideology that oppresses, right? I don't know if this is at all a helpful distinction, but that was just something that I was thinking about when I was reading your stuff. I was like, okay, so there's linguistic, but that feels different from like,
Yeah.
I feel oppressed by this ideology or the stereotype.
This is great. I love this question. It's because the nuance, I think, really matters. And also in some ways, I think helps people who maybe feel called out by this kind of thing to enter the conversation. Because, okay, standard language ideology or sociolinguistic ideology, folk idea, there's a number of them, right? Standard language ideology, Lippy Green comes in and tells us in 97 that there is a bias towards a language that's pulled from the middle class, the spoken language of the middle class, and that it's like a general preference for that language across domains and people. Part of what we were just talking about, like this idea of our language ideologies are older than print, that's where it comes from. Like the standard language ideology, this bias towards this preferred way of speaking that's aligned with this middle class is as old as the middle class, right? It is older than American English, older than every living language user. So the standard language ideology is something that is part of the linguistic system we're transferring in our genome. So whatever form and function that's taking, every new baby doesn't have to learn how to be like an upright, forward-facing, whatever, right? So we're transferring that information, these baseline categories about proper speech and improper speech, or an ideal speaker. Like there's maybe a category for ideal speaker in everybody, like an idea of disordered speech in everybody. That's where the standard language ideology comes in. When we're thinking about a bias, a lot of people maybe think about that as something that's much more active, but it really is this very fine line implicit thing that is, again, like about discrimination. It's about telling us like, this is an older voice, or this is a younger voice. This is a fast talker. This is a slow talker, right? This is a proper talker. This is an improper talker. Standard language ideology is maybe just something that just is, right? Linguistic oppression then is this act. It's like the difference between racism and racists. It's like racists are people who act on those beliefs, those like passive beliefs that all are just maybe part of our zeitgeist, that say like there is a right way to speak, or some people don't have accents. Like this idea of people taking that information and being like, my unaccented language is like this proper way, and I'm going to actively keep people out, not give them jobs. I work at the front desk of a doctor's office, and I know that we can't take everyone who calls. So I just do my own personal like screening and be like, oh, this person has a Southern accent. They don't sound that smart. And I don't want to have to deal with them when they come in here. So I'm just going to tell them we aren't taking patients, or that we don't have an apartment available.
Yeah.
This is a woman sitting here talking to me about her pain. So I'm just going to assume that she's blowing things out of proportion and isn't actually experiencing things that, I don't know, could be gallstones or cysts or fibroids or this or that. Or I'm just going to, not learn that endometriosis is a thing until my 40s, even though I'm an OBGYN. This kind of stuff is like, yeah, like how do you get through medical school without it? These kinds of things are linguistic oppression. Not every example means that those people in those places are like being actively racist or right. But it's this thing of, I operate inside a system. I support the status quo. I'm not critical. I'm not critical of the institutions I find myself in. And those institutions being the nuclear family.
Yeah.
American politics, any chosen religion, right? Like not just you work for Amazon or, your local school district. All of these things tie into standard language ideologies because there are understood ways that are correct or incorrect to talk to your wife or your boss or your children or this and that. And a lot of those understood defaults really leave a lot of people out of moving through social life without conflict.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to pick up on a couple of those things. So number one, the housing discrimination thing. This is something we've seen for a long time, right? Starting with John Baugh back in the day, back in the 90s. And then more recently, you actually did a study where you were looking at 3 different dialects and calling up to ask for an apartment. And this is a study that we've seen before, but basically the apartment is available for some people and not available for others, depending on the voice that you call in. And I think with your study, it was, you were using African-American English, Southern American English, and then sort of this mainstream American English. And the perception study and things like that of looking at what voice is considered polite, what voice is considered smart, what voice is considered educate, like all these different levels of things. And there's a heavy stigmatization of non-standard dialects in this country. So there's that. There's like who gets the apartment, what's the apartment. I mean, Trump has gotten in trouble for this. Of those people coming to his apartment and like it's a black family and suddenly the apartment's not available and there's a white person and it is. But then also you have talked a lot about this. I found this fascinating, by the way. You were talking about how, because I'd always known about this, right? Like that Black women's pain in hospitals is just, it is not taken seriously, right? And people die, they get seriously injured, all these things. There's so many stories, especially in childbirth, of women just not being believed that they're in severe pain. But then you start talking about how this actually might have to do with like differing levels of semantic intensity. Whoa, that's crazy. Because that means that it's not only just someone going, oh, you're a woman and you're Black, I don't believe you, but it's also that there's a difference in the mechanisms we're using to communicate pain that differs between mainstream American English and African American English. So it's all these things coming together to create a very bad situation that continues to happen in the healthcare system. So yeah.
Yeah, this is an important one because, okay, semantic intensity, but it actually goes to exactly what we're talking about. This idea of like standard language ideology on one side and linguistic oppression on the other. Standard language ideology, our language ideologies in general inform our expectations. So most of the time, you don't notice what your foot is doing unless you like step in water or something and you weren't expecting it. And you're like, oh, surprise, right? Like the N400 response of like, I've registered change. Yeah, like very exciting, right? So we know that this is what our brain is doing, is just kind of just running with its general expectations intact. Okay, so what do those expectations do like in the moment? They work on both sides of this equation, right? So a Black woman comes into a hospital and she's like, I have to make sure I speak as well as possible. I have to be as close to the standard as possible because I want to be understood quickly and this and that and get the exact answers that I need because I'm in peril. And then this person who is seeing a Black woman come in is expecting, like, if you are actually in pain, you're going to give me your most authentic language use. So you're going to come in here sounding like someone from the ghetto or someone who's an angry Black woman, like enraged. Like I'm expecting you to be hulking out if you were actually experiencing pain, because it insert like centuries of myth about the Black body and, et cetera. Like what, and women, we know they have a higher pain tolerance. So like even like a well-informed doctor, someone in the ER, right? Like even a well-informed doctor might have this expectation of, I have to see a bunch of people all the time. And this is what I think like a 10 on the pain scale looks like. This is what like how emergent cases present to me. So this Black woman who's trying her very best to be understood and is like holding down all of the feelings that she's feeling, meets someone who is expecting someone in a serious condition to not give a crap about the social contract and to just be like, I need help right now. But Black women can't walk into any room and say, I need help right now. It's just like not something that is possible. So many, and this divide is pertinent for almost all medical encounters. So it's there, right, with what someone is feeling and trying to communicate and what the medical profession is anticipating as symptoms of an emergent condition, right? But as with all of these other issues of oppression, this language barrier affects certain groups more than others. And so this rising maternal mortality rate for Black women that has continued to go up and up and up since we started keeping records, that has, even though other interventions have been made in the medical space to make things more accessible and more inclusive, is because this language barrier persists. And these language ideologies are as potent as they were the day we started keeping records. And so we don't see any motion on that score because the interactional moment is so fraught.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's horrifying.
It's horrifying. And there's also this idea, right? Like you were talking about how like there's this like expectation that the doctor has that someone's going to be completely enraged and like completely flip out and they have no control over their voice if they're really in this much pain. And it reminded me of this idea that was put forth. So at the Linguistic Society of America, Dr. Sharice King gave a presentation of her research on our perception of Black voices in courtroom settings. So if it's a witness, if it's a prosecutor, how do we feel they're credible? Do we feel they're intelligent? Right, all these things. And then are they speaking African American English or mainstream American English? And does the person being tested in the experiment know that this is a Black person or not? And Dan Viriel raises his hand and says, I'm wondering if this is less about the fact that we are upset that someone is using African American English or that we are judging their use of African American English, but more that as like the white jury member that is conscious that code switching exists, if we're actually punishing Black people for not code switching. And I feel like that is the reverse in the hospital, right? Of you're coming into this place and it's like, I like doing whatever you can to get the help that you need. And then whatever it is, it just isn't enough because either you're not emotional enough or you're too emotional or it's not believable enough or that's unrealistic. How could you be that much in pain?
The forensic linguistics literature is really fascinating. There's this one study about a Latino man in Southern California court who uses a translator, which is itself apparently very fraught. So he goes onto the stand and he says in English, my English is not that good. It's my second language. I want to use a translator because I want to make sure that I understand everything that I'm being asked and then I can give you all correct and detailed information. He like says that in learner English and then proceeds to answer the prosecutor's questions in Spanish through the translator. But then when the prosecutor is like closing, like the closing argument or whatever, he's like, you can't even trust this guy because he told you that he couldn't understand me, but then he answered some of my questions before the translator was even done. So like, how could you know what he's saying to you is true? Because he could talk to you in English, but he chose not to. He wanted you to have a harder time understanding him. And this person who is testifying, I mean, he's like a witness. Like this person in this case who's testifying for gets the death penalty, like goes to jail for the rest of his life. And if California was executing people, he'd be executed by now. Maybe he will be executed later. Do you know what I mean? Like this thing of, it's not just about these like most dire cases. Like I understand like those are the ones we talk about. This example that I'm giving where it's like this person went to prison. These people, they get acquitted or not acquitted. They can't get justice. A lot of this like this ear witness testimony is in like domestic abuse or sexual assault cases. And so it's these things where it's like I know that it was this person even though I didn't see anything because I heard them next door. And so it's like we want that testimony to work.
Yeah.
We want it to work. We want the science to be maybe the best science we're doing
Yeah.
in linguistic science is the ones that can limit someone's freedom directly, specifically as part of our law. And so, yeah, these cases where Charisse, as Dr. King was on my committee, my defense dissertation committee, she's actually, her work with Dr. Bickford, that is my why I do what I do moment.
Yep.
I saw them present that before the paper came out at the LSA. It was like my second LSA.
And this is hearing Rachel Jean
The
Tell. This is
Jean-Tel,
that, yeah, the Jean-Tel paper. Yeah.
I was currently in my first sociophonetics class. And I was like, okay, sociophonetics, we can actually do something real in the world. Like I could do like the Zimmerman trial, I was glued to it. I was furious.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like I get there and I have all of this energy for it. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, we can actually use our science to show like exactly why this happened and why this is a problem and how language is playing a role in all of these outcomes like right now. Like it's not even old.
Yeah. And I also, with the whole, hearing Rachel Jean-Tel, I mean, like, that's a linguistics paper that like makes you cry. I mean, like, it is the most interesting paper, I think, to read, just because you are so angry and so frustrated that a young 19-year-old girl's language can be picked apart and degraded to this extent, right? When we're talking about a murder trial. And yet, like, also the frustration that, why do we have to, as linguists, make a case that someone's language is legitimate or valid or systematic, right? Like it has to be. It's language. And like, and we know that, but like the rest of the world doesn't know that. But then also at the other hand, so Don Rickford is a professor emeritus, I think at Stanford now, and his wife Angela Rickford is also professor emeritus at San Jose State. And I was talking to her, and she said, "Yeah, we went down to see Rachel, sort of like when the paper was published and everything, and I started teaching her how to read." And I said, "What?" She was 19 when the trial. No. She went to like a really bad public school in a very low income area with teachers that did not care and classmates that that's not what's happening, and there's probably high rates of truancy. And so that's the project, was teaching her how to read and kind of that whole thing.
Yeah. There's a few interesting points, but what you said, people ask me a lot about, well, how can it even work? Like the censorship that people are trying with like getting books out of libraries and getting people's words out of people's mouths. Like, can it even work? Of course it can. Because Rachel Jean-Tel is a perfect example of like a woman in this country with, access to all public opportunities available to her, and still didn't have full access to the written word. The illiteracy rates are, Black people are like 13% of our population, but 27% of the nation's illiterate. Like the ripples are still rippling. They haven't made it all the way to the shore yet from these anti-literacy laws. They're still affecting the ways in which Black people and Black language has developed.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think like your study on the housing discrimination, I didn't know this so recently, but it was your voice. You were doing your 3 native dialects to like show the difference between mainstream American English, Southern American English, and then African American English. And that's a choice that's, I mean, it's kind of a privilege to be able to make that choice every day, to like have that to be. And I mean, again, there's this tension, right, between like the idea of a standard variety, of a standard anything, is problematic, right? Like that is a problematic notion. There needs to be the standard variety in order for someone to be understood. But also this tension between like, to be able to be understood is a privilege, and it translates to like tangible benefits in the world. So,
and this is the question, because it's not accessible to everyone. It's not accessible. And this is why like embodiment is such a part of what I am interested in now, because we could read the same sonnet, to each other, and it would not be exactly the same. We are 2 different people. You can't say the same utterance the same way twice. It's like why we talk about this like infinite generation of language, right? It's interesting, right? But yeah, my own voice, encountering this as like a theoretical concept and being like, differently embodied people can't make language in the same way, and then being like, okay, but that is like that's like making this assumption, departing from a place of being like one person, one body, one variety. Like my one person, one body, one variety can't make language the same as your one person, one body, one variety. Okay. But that's not real because we all have this like constellation of features at our disposal. So part of asking the question, being inspired by Bob's work, he used his own voice. I went into that work like not knowing, being like, oh, this is how like you do a match guys study. You just like make your own stimuli and you go in and do it. Spending a number of years digging through data of people analyzing me very differently, with incredibly minimal movement in my repertoire. Like we're talking about pitch changes and some creative rearranging of vowel space. The phrasing is the same. It's not
Yeah.
significantly different speech, in my opinion, to my trained ear, right?
Yeah, I mean, the clip of the study of your voice in African American English, it's what a linguist might call standard African American
It
English,
is
right?
that.
Because there's an absence of these morphosyntactic, syntactic variables or features of African American English, which we know are more heavily stigmatized than the phonological variation. So
Exactly.
even then, right? Right,
Yeah,
yeah.
and both of them. So there's like a big, really meaty footnote in there, about how I did earlier work. I did like some prior work where we had very almost like mock dialect versions of all three, because the standard one sounded like an NPR host. It was like all the way up there. And yeah, and the other two, and then the Southern one was much more Southern. Like to me, part of the reason why I redid the stimuli at all is because I'm from the South. I'm from the American South. And I was like, this sounds like a cartoon. Like, I understand that it came out of my own mouth, but nobody in Knoxville sounds this way. And we're going to be running this study in Knoxville. So, like, it needs to sound more local. It needs to sound more natural. And that's when we decided to just like go with my own voice. The thing that gets me the most, that maybe ties into this larger conversation we're having in the assessments of my voice in the housing study, which they're kind of two studies. There's like, I audited people to say like, if I call the same landlord, like, do we see whatever? And we do see whatever. The other study then is like taking recordings from those calls and being like, what do people do with this in the lab? Like, what are they hearing? How do they pull it apart? What's really interesting in how they pull it apart is, and part of what maybe puts some of this into more detail is none of these people are being like, that's a Black voice and I don't like it because blah,
Yeah.
I'm asking like, rate this voice on 10 character traits.
Yeah.
And one of those traits is feminine and masculine, two separate traits. They're not on like binary ends of a spectrum. It's like 0 to 100. Like, this is the most feminine voice I've ever heard, or this is the most masculine voice I've ever heard, right? The Black voice, the Black dialect, is rated as the more masculine sounding voice, but they're all clearly on the feminine end of the spectrum, right? Like, it's not masculine at all. Like, it's the rating for the masculine voice, the highest number is 15. So it's 15% male sounding versus like 13 versus like 11. So it's like not even that much of a range, right? But okay, I don't have the most feminine voice ever, right? Okay. That spread of points, when you get through all the math, masculinity leads to massive decreases in trustworthiness and intelligence, which are the two things that are apparently most important for the landlord who's listening, right? Of like, are you going to be breaking stuff all the time or having friends over or doing whatever, like this kind of thing. They want to know that you're trustworthy. We're talking about 4 points.
Yeah.
We're talking about 4 percentage points. We're talking about something that is barely, like, we would think would be barely perceptible, but it's incredibly perceptible. And it's so much so that it really influences people. So Black female speech is rated highly masculine. We also know that like Black speech, like Black vernacular speech, has these like masculinization tendencies. Norma Mendoza-Denton has done some really good work on that, especially looking at like the creations, and R.S. Clemens on the creations of like a Dominican identity, which sits like in between like Latinidad and the Black community and immigrant communities. Really, really interesting about how like machismo plays out in African American language and stuff like that. So it's something to do with, I know that angry Black woman is a thing. I know that people maybe hear my voice is more masculine and therefore more aggressive. And so when I go into the doctor's office or when I'm calling the landlord, I'm trying so hard to be like, hi, Jim.
It's interesting to me. I kind of have a question about that whole thing of like the masculinity, because it's interesting that
Hmm.
Black women are seen as less trustworthy and all these things for sounding more masculine. But what about the men that sound incredibly masculine?
Yeah, and men who sound more feminine are less trustworthy as well. So it's not like a one-to-one. It's not like,
Ooh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
I guess your most masculine sounding male is your, yeah, very trustworthy, but your most masculine sounding female, not. Me-
Is it your most masculine sounding white male? How
That's
does it?
yes, probably.
Yeah,
That's a
okay.
good
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
That's a good question
Yeah.
because I think American listeners will trust anything a British accented person says.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean,
So they
colonization.
don't,
Well,
so it's
but you
that of
don't find
like,
whiteness and intelligence sec what? Kelly. Yeah.
you said something earlier about attractiveness. Attractiveness is interesting because we make a decision about that as fast as we do all these other things. So when we're listening, age, gender, class, right, race, sexuality, all of that comes really fast within 300 milliseconds. But we also make a decision about, do we trust this person? How smart are they? How hot are they? We decide all in this like band of milliseconds. And there's debate on which happens first or if one informs the other or whatever. And that's probably different for everybody, a little different for everybody. But I think, yeah, it's so fascinating that we're like, do I trust you? Are you hot?
Yeah, it is interesting. I had a professor tell me once that being like successful in linguistics, or like they said it sort of like offhandedly to the room. They were like, being hot, I recommend. Being a hot linguist, I really recommend, because then maybe you'll like popularize the field or something.
Steven Pinker, obviously,
Oh
hottest
yes,
linguist I can
right,
think of. Right?
right,
Do you know
like
what I mean?
right,
Like,
right,
come
right,
on.
right, like Steve with his hair.
Like,
Yeah.
no offense, sir, but a Helmsworth, you are not.
No, but like I don't think anyone was like judging him. No one was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, like young bright, very very bright student from McGill or whatever. Oh
Right.
yeah, let's not accept him to the PhD program cuz like what? Like
Yeah.
like and little and then again, I feel like also that with like men for some reason it's this thing where it's like once there's status and once there's money and once there's intelligence, like doesn't really matter what they look like.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. There is a lot of work, people out here who are asking a lot of these really nuanced questions about what it means to like do gender. I think that this growing area of the field, where people are really starting to investigate that, and it matters because, as you're saying, like women, this idea of like sociolinguistic labor, I struggle to communicate this idea to men that sociolinguistic labor is even a thing, that it's something that's done, that it's something that people are aware of. And then I have this whole other group of people who just comes up and is like, oh, I totally get this. Like this happens, like example, example, example. And so for me, it opens up questions about like knowledge building and what it means to, what meaning is, what it means to know stuff. Because common knowledge, like the ways in which we build something that's generally understood, that goes into building these language ideologies. That goes into maintaining the standard language ideology of saying that there's one preferred way to do things. How do we begin to edit our ideologies? We see that happen over time. They certainly change. The ways that we think about women are not all the same. But there may be echoes of these like older, women are weaker, women are not as smart, women are this, women are that. But we see just like playing out and being maintained in these like more subtle ways. Like the housing discrimination is the same in that segregation has not been legal for over 50 years. Integration, I mean, it was this idea of we just take down the walls, right? And then you all can live in harmony. That's what happens. We just make it explicitly illegal to bar you. But all of those neighborhoods have maintained their character over time, the ones that haven't been gentrified, because we just police those boundaries ourselves. We do all of that work. We move it all into the linguistic space where it can be done less overtly. And so the populations that I am most interested in protecting like are the women who are at most at risk in all of these areas that we've been talking about, because yeah, they they seem to be the ones that need our collective help, like as a field the most. Like
And men of color. I mean that is like a huge site of linguistic oppression as well, especially Black men. Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, we really see this in high risk jobs. So men of color who and people who don't have access to English, like immigrants, get offered a job that pays a lot of money. they get paperwork, like a hold harmless clause for the company of saying like, as you wade waist deep into toxic waste, you may experience like any of these negative symptoms or whatever. And they're like, great, I get paid $80 an hour. Fantastic. Like I will go do that. And so then there are those are the populations that experience the most on-the-job deaths. So across industries in the United States, English language learners and men of color are the people who experience the most on-the-job deaths because they don't understand the information that's given to them, or they aren't given information that acknowledges them of the risk. And so the only ways that certain things get done, like mixing up the materials that pave our streets, cleaning our sewers, getting high-speed internet to rural areas, those kinds of things are done by a population of workers that is expected to die.
That's really sad. Wow.
And that expectation is maintained through this linguistic ignorance.
Yeah. And whose life is worth it. Wow.
Yeah, there's a profit margin. There's a profit margin by keeping people out of equitable communication.
You are working towards goals that are bigger than one field. You are working towards goals of racial and social justice, equality, equity, things like that, right? Decolonization, like anti-racism, anti-sexism, all these things come through your work, and it's so inspiring to watch. This is not just about language, but yet you're doing it through language. You're studying language. So why linguistics? Why language?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think for me, I am still continually fascinated by language with the capital L. I mean, from when I took my first class as an undergraduate until today, the wonder only increased at all of these things that we can do, that we do with it, that we are even capable of communicating with all of these variables, that somehow all of the stuff that our field is desperately trying to figure out and describe, the human, the organ, the system, has it completely figured out. We are doing language as experts with individually contained systems all day, every day, right? So that to me is still part of the reason why I do the work that I do that's equity focused, is because I want everyone to get at a place where they can share in this wonder that I have, where they can sit down and look at their own language use, look at language being used around them and being like, isn't that so cool? Look at how different it is. Look at how expansive it is. Like, how everyone does everything differently. And isn't that so neat? Like, that's like isn't that so neat place that I just want everyone to arrive at with me, please. And I really do feel that with just a little more general understanding of what every single one of us is doing every day with this system that structures our thoughts and helps us share ideas and build society. A lot of these issues, these most, acute harms maybe start to fade away on their own, right? Or just at the end of the day, products of misunderstanding. So I hope that we can, move towards the side of recognizing and celebrating instead of recognizing and vilifying. Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening to Tomato Tomato. I have been your host, Talia Sherman, and that was my conversation with the amazing Dr. Kelly Elizabeth Wright, current postdoc at Virginia Tech. As a reminder, please head over to YouTube to view and watch the full unedited version of this interview. It's lovely. It's a lot of fun. There's so much energy in there. As always, if you feel so inclined, please rate, review, and subscribe. And I will speak to you next time, where I will be interviewing for the first time ever in a long-form interview format, a non-academic, a real-life person who is not a professor. So stay tuned for that. I'll speak to you next time. Bye.